So we're getting ready to start our next panel.
And then,
If I could ask the members of our panel to start making their way up to the stage. We have 2 of them here already. Oh, now we have 3 of them here. Wait, Wes, where are you going? Wes is trying to sneak away.
come on.
And then we need Jaime from the ACHP. And here she comes. So please go ahead and get some coffee or some tea, some snacks. And we are going to get underway. And I'm very excited to introduce this panel because it has the best title that you could possibly think of for the topic. So this is the Army Corps needs an appendectomy. And Tom King, I believe, was responsible for coming up with that phrase. But it's perfect because we are talking about the Army Corps' intention to rescind Appendix C. So the Army Corps, and this was Wes's terminology, is doing a little bit of its surgery on itself to remove one of its appendices. So that's what these folks are here to talk with us about this morning. And I think it's a topic that we are all very interested in hearing about. So we have Jaime Pinkham, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works. Sheila Bird, the Principal Consultant of Kituwah Nighthawk. And of course, as we know, the host of THPO Talk. I hope some of you have taken advantage of the opportunity to,
We'll start recording.
at noon, she says, we're going to start recording. Jamie Loichinger, she's the Assistant Director at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation. And of course, still Wes, it's his second stage for today from the Native American Rights Fund. So I'm going to let you folks take it away. You are responsible for moderating yourselves.
Okay. So we strategized a little bit in the audience before we came up. But the topic, no doubt, will we're going to need some room at the end for some questions for the tribes. I think this is a unique panel to get a lot of our questions answered and comments heard. But I guess it's fair to say that we can finally say that we all agree on something. The THPOs agree, the SHPOs agree, federal agencies agree, environmental groups agree, communities agree that Appendix C doesn't work for any of us. We actually put our heads together, and I've read about every docket comment, all 139 of them, because I have that deep of an interest on where we're going with this. When I first became a THPO, one of the veteran THPOs told me, it will never change and you will die fighting Appendix C. So I started counting my fingers on how many more years I had to live. I'm glad it's happening right now in this day and time. But we want to start off kind of just with the flow as we kind of sit down here. And we're going to let Jaime Pinkham, which I'm so glad he's here. He's the guy that you want to talk to. He's the one that's going to answer some of these questions. I'm going to give some tribal comments at the end. But I'm really honored to be sitting up here leading this panel today. And I've talked to a lot of the tribes and asked, what do you want me to say? But I know the mic is going to be available at the end for you to say. But let's go ahead and get started with Mr. Jaime Pinkham.
Thank you. Thanks, Wes. That's mewi inam latiwa. Ka nibipu token timki chichpa. So yapa timki Jaime Pinkham. Thank you for allowing me to be on this panel with a topic that has been a source of frustration and disagreement for far too long. And you can tell by the tension of this topic, it's what the title was built around. Yes, an appendectomy is prescribed when the appendix becomes inflamed, or in this case, inflames others like tribal historic preservation officers. Removing an appendix requires surgical skill. So yes, not anyone, just anyone can do it. So you need specialists up to the task. And yes, they say that when it's over, life goes on because we can live without it. So I'm hoping that you don't prove me wrong. And I have this admission. I've spent nearly my entire career working in Indian country, including 2 terms on NATHPO's tribal council. And it was after I was sworn in, it was the first time I heard of this conflict around Appendix C. And so I want to give a couple of shout outs. First to Reed Nelson from ACHP. Within a few months of my being sworn in almost 2 years ago to the day, Reed was on my calendar explaining to me the issue behind Appendix C. And I appreciate Reed's diplomacy and his spirit of cooperation as we work towards a solution. And my second shout out is to Valerie, who was right on Reed's heel to shine a light to this through a tribal lens point of view about Appendix C. And believe me, both of them early in my tenure made a difference. And so after those 2 calls, I quickly understood the lingering anxiety over this, the disagreement around undertakings in the permit area or the area of potential effect. It created confusion amongst the regulated public. Historic preservation officers questions Appendix C's legitimacy, which led to challenges during tribal consultations and began to raise questions whether the Corps was meeting their statutory as well as their tribal trust responsibility. Well, for me, it was still early in the Biden administration, and we were dealing with pressures with the immediacy of change nationally, as well as these place-based hotspots. And the pressure of that change is proportional to how far that pendulum swings from one administration to the next. But regarding Appendix C, I requested the regulatory leadership at Army Corps to provide me with a briefing. And during that session, I was really pleased that no one from the Corps of Engineers mentioned that this was merely a situation where we simply agreed to disagree. Because to me, certainly that was not the case, especially when you weigh in with the administration's initiatives around tribal relations and environmental justice. Unfortunately, the following November, Mike Connor was finally confirmed. It was like 95 or 92-5 vote on the Senate floor. Mike was confirmed as Assistant Secretary for Civil Works, my boss. And so we had the team complete. During Mike's second week on the job, I had a chance to sit down with him and brief him about Appendix C. He agreed with the diagnosis. And so I called Valerie and I said, yeah, we're going to schedule the appendectomy. But there was, we felt good about our tribal engagement to that point, but still there are over 570 tribal governments. So it was fundamental to our nation-to-nation responsibilities to try to engage more of Indian country. And so the task was how to go about it. After Mike's first 100 days, he convened the leadership team and we all sat with him and we shaped 5 focus areas to help with the civil works effort within Army, help civil works in moving the needle forward on the Biden-Harris administration's agenda. And so we shaped these 5 focus areas, and generally they deal with supply chains, climate resilient infrastructure, research and development, and strengthening communications and relations. And the 5th one is to modernize civil works to better serve the needs across society. So this 5th one really focuses on the administration's agenda with a mix of initiatives from Justice 40, environmental justice, tribal consultation, disadvantaged communities, and so forth. And for us, replacing Appendix C was really about modernizing how we do business. So it became a priority within our modernization agenda. So in addition to Appendix C, we had a lot on our plate with initiatives to advance tribal interests within the modernization agenda. We bundled all these topics together into a single Federal Register notice, which we issued in June of last year, announcing this wide range of efforts, including Appendix C as part of the package. And structurally, with the amount of time that we've had, in a 4-year term to try to get all this work done, a comprehensive launch for us was more resourceful compared to a series of these individual Federal Register notices that trickle out over time. And so around these ones particular to tribes, we had 7 virtual sessions. And let me briefly review the modernization agenda for civil works. And the first was to update Army Corps' tribal consultation policy, which we got input on that, and our policy is currently under review at the leadership level. Another one was around Army Corps' Tribal Partnership Program, which was a program that was recently reauthorized in the Water Resource Development Act of 2022. And this program it's a cost share program that helps tribes in studies, design, construction of water resource related projects. And there's growing interest in this program, but it was really being underutilized. So we want to issue some additional guidance to expand its use, but consistent with its authorization. The feedback from the tribes were very encouraging, wanting us to streamline contracting processes, but also to recognize the tribal capacity around engineering and construction, that we can contract those projects directly with tribes rather than working with third parties. Another one in the modernization is what we call Principles, Requirements, and Guidelines, PRNG. All water resource management agencies in the federal government have these agency-specific guidelines on how to implement PRNG, and the Corps has still to do theirs. So we're going to launch a rulemaking effort around this. And what it will do, it'll widen how Army Corps will review civil works projects just beyond evaluating it for its under the National Academic Development Model, but also by accounting for these comprehensive community benefits, including social and environmental outcomes. And again, this will integrate the administration's policies around environmental justice, resiliency, sustainability, and also encourage community-driven solutions in planning and design. Another area with a touch point with tribes is environmental justice. And Mike had issued this interim guidance last year. And so we wanted input from the field to help sharpen that guidance as we move forward. But also we were required by Congress to come up with a definition of a disadvantaged community. So we worked on that definition, and it's a definition that we hope to be releasing soon. Another area that we had a lot of tribal interest is it's called Nationwide Permit 12. And some of you know the history of that, and it has to do with oil and gas pipelines. There was a lot of opposition. I was dealing with this early in my tenure, and I felt we needed to take a look at Nationwide Permit 12 and a few other ones, because EJ communities were waking up and finding out a pipeline was being planned for their backyard, and they had no input on that decision. And so we wanted to revisit that, held a series of engagement sessions where the input was widespread. The other thing is, as we were doing these modernizing sessions, we were also doing listening sessions around the Clean Water Act's definition of waters of the US. I mean, there's a lot going on for us, engagement with Indian country. Recent Supreme Court hearing last fall, and we expect the Supreme Court will issue a decision on this challenge coming from the state of Idaho on WOTUS. But back to Appendix C, which is an important part of this package. We had two engagement sessions specific to this, and I want to thank NATHPO for their assistance during those sessions. We had two additional sessions open to all these tribal topics where Appendix C was brought up. About 300 participants. We also entertained requests for individual tribal consultations, and some tribes did do that, and we did consultations with them on the whole package of the modernized effort. But in the end, we got just under 130 letters, touched on Appendix C, a quarter of them from tribes. And the input from the tribes and the state historic preservation officers were nearly unanimous. Revoke Appendix C. But in our notice, we also posed these questions about how do you go about it? How do you replace it? Would some of the 800 regulations, the program alternatives, be useful as we move towards a solution and a new strategy? And believe me, the tribal input was helpful in determining the path forward. So in November, we were ready to announce during the president's second convening with tribal leaders that we would go through a rulemaking to rescind Appendix C, bringing the Army Corps of Engineers under the 800 regulations. We plan to issue the Federal Register notice sometime this spring. These things do take a little bit of time. That will move the effort to do rulemaking to rescind Appendix C. But already we're thinking about the replacement because the input we receive from the tribes is, there needs to be clarification and some guidance around, the area of impact. So we'll be working during this time with ACHP on a joint guidance document to provide clarification. But also during the rulemaking process, we want to do nation to nation consultation to help inform how we're going to get to that joint guidance. So your engagement, we're going to be asking for more help moving this thing forward. So when this is all said and done, we hope to have the rescission of Appendix C and the joint guidance in place before the end of this calendar year. So yes, most appendectomies are outpatient surgeries, but no, it's not the same for the Corps or federal agencies, because an appendectomy through federal rulemaking is about timing, it's about stamina and willpower, and it's all done without anesthesia. So I want to thank you for all your for listening today, but really thank you the most for your persistence, your support, and encouragement to finally get us to this point in time. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you, Mr. Pinkman. Next, we're going to hear from the NATHPO NARF attorney. I think you guys heard a lot from him last session with the TCPs. So we're going to hear from Wesley Furlong, staff attorney for the Native American Rights Fund.
Great, thank you, Sheila. And unfortunately, unlike Ira, I only have to do 2 of these, not 3. So this is the last everyone gets to hear from me today. Yeah, I mean, and like in Sheila's introduction, when I first started working in this area, I was also told that I would never see Appendix C changed or go away. And I think, certainly I have been working on this far fewer years than many people in here and having to deal with it. It, even within my short career, it's very exciting to see, certainly this administration taking this effort to rescind Appendix C and move on from that. And I think it's a good first step in, hopefully laying the groundwork for some repairing of relationships between the Army Corps and Indian country. I think there's many other issues that are not just Appendix C, but this one is a large issue and hopefully a relatively easy one to fix, despite the rulemaking process taking a long time. Fortunately, I don't have to spend this whole time talking about why Appendix C is bad and why we should get rid of it, because as Sheila said, we all agree on that point now. So I want to sort of take this opportunity to sort of pose some not necessarily questions, but sort of pose some things to the group to think about as this rulemaking process commences and and going into the eventual consultation that the Army Corps will do with Indian country. And as the Secretary Pinkham pointed out and mentioned, particularly sort of like the guidance and the implementation of the rescission, what happens next. The rescinding Appendix C is the easy part. It's maybe it's a little too simplified, but it's relatively it's the easy part, right? It's posting a Federal Register notice, going through that process, and then finalizing it and removing it from the regulations. The difficult part is what happens next in implementing that rescission, and how do individual districts move forward using Part 800 and using a set of regulations that everyone else has been using for decades, but that will be brand new to an agency that has a seemingly very outsized role in Indian country. So that's sort of what I wanted to just sort of to touch on is sort of the next steps, what happens next. What I encourage people, this is basically my spiel, is encouraging people to think about these things and either raise them here today or raise them when this process moves forward with the rulemaking. But one of those things is the guidance, as was discussed. I think in my experience, and probably in most people's experiences, the Part 8, the 106 process outlined in Part 800 does not require any changes to be applicable to what the Army Corps does in its regulatory permitting role, right? I certainly don't feel that there's a need to sort of carve out guidance on how to make it fit with the Army Corps' permitting process. And I think what I've heard is that this guidance will be more about informing the districts and division commands on how to utilize Part 800. And for a long time, I guess essentially for almost going on 43 years, the Corps has been utilizing regulations that are fundamentally different, and parts of those are fundamentally different from Part 800. And so what I hope to see is guidance that clarifies to district commands, to the commanders, to the chiefs of regulatory, to their project managers, to their archaeologists, all the way down to the ground level of folks that are working on these permit processes and permit applications. What are the differences between, clarifying the differences that this is how Appendix C worked, and this is how Part 800 works, and ensuring that the people who are implementing this on the ground understand the differences, and so that they are, when they move forward under Part 800, they're doing it correctly, and they're doing it in a way that is consistent with how we all expect them to do it, and how other agencies would be doing it as well. One of my fears would be seeing the rescission and seeing the position of the Corps as we're going to use Part 800, and we're utilizing area of potential effect, and we're utilizing the Part 800 definition of undertaking, but still then interpreting that to be just as restrictive as Appendix C is today. So for me, I would hope to see guidance that clarifies the differences between these two, and how this current process, how the Part 800 process fits and works within the Corps' permitting process, so that it is not, maybe new, but it's not something that is going to be disruptive to how the Corps does its work. The other big thing that I would point out or mention, and for people to be thinking about, is and it was mentioned a little bit, particularly Nationwide Permit 12, but more generally the nationwide permitting program broadly. And in the nationwide permitting program, Section 106 is, I hesitate to use the word governed by, but it's addressed to a degree in General Condition 20 to all the nationwide permits. So they're applicable to, I think there's 58. Something like that. Yeah. With the rescission of Appendix C, to me, one of the outstanding questions is what happens to the Army Corps Section 106 compliance when it comes to issuing and reissuing nationwide permits, on whether that's during the regular 5-year interval, or if there's times where they're going to be reevaluating these permits sooner. It's most projects that fall under the Army Corps permitting jurisdiction are going to be authorized under a nationwide permit, and most likely will proceed without even the need for a project proponent to submit a pre-construction notification to the Army Corps and let anyone know that they're even doing the project. So I think there's always been a need to address in a much more significant and meaningful way Section 106 compliance for the issuance and reissuance of nationwide permits. And I think with the rescission of Appendix B, the impending rescission of Appendix C, there's all the more need to address that, because I think it will sort of, with the rescission of Appendix C, beg the question, now what do we do about Section 106 for nationwide permits? And I think rescinding Appendix C is the easier first step, but there's these additional steps. So I would encourage folks to be thinking about what that would look like, and what they would like to see Section 106 can look like for projects that fall under the authority of a nationwide permit. And lastly, this is the last thing I'll sort of just mention is, we're at a point with the administration's announcement at the end of November that they are going to move forward with rescinding Appendix C. We're looking probably sometime by the end of the calendar year that would potentially happen. What happens in the interim? And that's sort of my I guess my personally, my larger question to the Department of the Army and the Army Corps is what happens in the interim with ongoing projects that are currently under Army Corps review now, and projects that will start before the rescission is finalized. And so my encouragement, my personal encouragement would be for the Army Corps and the Department of the Army and the Assistant Secretary's offices, think about issuing some sort of interim guidance for this period where we are acknowledging that Appendix C is no longer going to be utilized to potentially direct districts in future undertakings that will occur in this interim, that will start during this interim period, to potentially to not use Appendix C despite the fact that it hasn't been rescinded yet, and potentially to direct district commands to engage in consultation in ongoing Section 106 processes with consulting parties about utilizing Part 800 moving forward. These are, I don't think that switching should be, I personally don't think it will be disruptive, should be that disruptive. I would imagine that folks in districts would think so, but I think there's a, I think there's a recognition that we're moving away from Appendix C, and there's a long period of relatively short, but still a long period of time where there's been this recognition by the administration that we're moving away from Appendix C, but it's not going to have happened yet. And so it seems to me odd that we would move forward with projects that are ongoing, and certainly projects that will come online or start the review in this interim period, and default back to the processes that we've acknowledged, or the administration has acknowledged, that we're moving away from. So those are the sort of things that I've been thinking about as the next steps in moving forward. The rescission is the easy part, and then that next step, implementing that and making sure that it happens, and that it is that the districts themselves understand what they need to be doing and do it correctly. So I'm just sort of posing those as things for people to think about. Those are the things that I've been thinking about recently. And as the formal rulemaking process commences later this year, and the opportunity to engage in consultation and to submit public comments, those are the sorts of things that I'm personally going to be thinking about, and working with NATHPO and their comments on this to develop recommendations about how we think some of these things may be going forward. And we're certainly going to be turning to NATHPO's membership in Indian country and listening to what everyone else has to say about that, and following in the lead of Indian country on these issues. But those are the sorts of things that we're thinking about as we move forward in this new world absent of Appendix C.
Thank you, Wes. Next, we're going to be hearing from Jaime Loichinger. She's the Assistant Director at the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation.
Thank you. I just wanted to say how nice it is to be with you all today. This is actually my first time getting to attend a NATHPO conference. Not sure how I got to be lucky enough to be with you guys, but thank you for inviting me to be here. And I appreciate the opportunity to sit on this panel with everyone. At the ACHP, I oversee the section that deals with federal permitting, licensing, and assistance agencies. So a lot of what the Corps deals with when it comes to their regulatory program are issues that we see from other agencies. So I think we're well equipped to assist with some of the issues that they're going to encounter in a post-Appendix C world. We have been using the time wisely. So we're getting underway now with outlining what that joint guidance that Mr. Pinkham referenced, what it might look like, and really what existing guidance is out there that is maybe applicable or would be useful for an agency like the Corps. I think the biggest thing for me is how do we supplement that with examples so that Corps staff can really see the difference in permit versus undertaking, area of potential effect versus permit area. Those words, I think, when I've talked with some Corps staff, they don't necessarily appreciate those differences and what it means to really, when you say permit area, you're not really taking into account the full range of effects that would be considered under 106. So I think the guidance is a chance to kind of explain and give a little bit more context to those differences, and then using examples to illustrate, well, here's how it was defined the area of potential or the permit area was defined in this undertaking, but in a post Appendix C world, here's how it could have been defined as an area of potential effect. And then using the reasonable and good faith effort that's there in the regulations to take into account things like the nature and level of federal involvement. The core regulatory program, we think of the huge projects. There's a lot of little projects that happen every day that don't need or require that full on level of, 100% identification of historic property. So we're also looking at the guidance to consider the smallest projects, the smaller projects, the medium projects, and then the big projects, and how the Corps would define the undertaking, delineate the area of potential effect, and what the level of identification effort would look like in each of those situations. It's a full-on collaborative effort at the ACHP. I'm talking from the Section 106 office, but we've been closely coordinating with the Office of Native American Affairs, with Ira's office, and then also our general counsel has been looking forward to this day for decades. So has John Edens. I hope some of you have, either seen John Edens, talked with John Edens, been in a meeting with him. He's working on letters right now. He's actually been emailing me other ideas to bring up today with you guys. So just know John Edens has been so excited for this day for many a year. And I know he's looking forward to kind of sharing his thoughts. He's had a lot of time to think about, these different kinds of projects and what different levels of 106 would look like to take into account. We've always said at the ACHP when we've had these conversations before with the Corps that we think the regulations have the flexibility that the core regulatory program needs, to recognize that there are these different kinds of projects that maybe they have more control over or there is more federal involvement and we can do more versus some of the other smaller projects. I think we have to acknowledge that as well. So I think the guidance is primarily for core staff, but also, I think it's going to be really useful for consulting parties as you go into a post-Appendix C world. What might a reasonable area of potential effect look like so that you can, as you're at these consultation meetings, provide input to the Corps about what an appropriate level of identification would look like because they've delineated the APE more appropriately. So there's a lot to kind of think about there. I don't expect it will be easy. It's like miles 1 through 3 of a marathon. We're all feeling good. And miles 10 through 13 are going to be a slog, and it will require us working together and navigating a lot of tricky areas. But I also have deeply appreciated, the enthusiasm that we've had at the ACHP, but being here with the Corps, and knowing how committed you all are to this effort, and then getting to hear from you all today about what other points we need to really emphasize in the joint guidance. And John Edens and I are always around if anybody wants to call or email. We're here to learn and think about what else needs to be in there. So I'll probably end there because I'm more interested in the conversation we're going to have on this part. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think both Jaimes actually answered some of my other questions, points that I was going to bring up. I'm only going to bring up a few points because we want the tribes to be able to ask questions and get some feedback today. Tribal consultation, we know that it hasn't been effective. Even their own interagency government accountability office found them deficient in the 2019 report. So we're glad that we're bringing that forward right now so that we can include a true tribal voice and exercise our nation to nation government consultation. So I'm glad to hear that. One of the things that I wanted to bring up real quick was the fact that we just left a TCP conversation talking about Bulletin 38. That is not included in Appendix C. They do not have that discussion in Appendix C. That's still attached to our cultural position enough where they have issued a bulletin. And I like when people said it's a bulletin. It's left up to interpretation. And that's some of the challenges that we've had with the different districts. The level of application between the districts have not been consistent. We have different working relationships with each of them, and the commanders are left with that level of interpretation. We have been pushing for a long time to have tribal consultation to be figured into the body of the law. You know, it's good that they're combining efforts here to create guidance. But again, when we talk about teeth, there's some, it is an issuance from our federal leaders, but as in regards to teeth, it is still left up to the interpretation of the commanders at that point. And us as working THPOs, we knew that we had different relationships with these different districts and sometimes one better than the other. So I also wanted to bring up that Appendix C does not include account for human remains and the associated funerary objects. Doesn't include any of that, which I think for us as tribes, that's one of the trying to stay out of a NAGPRA situation, which we already know our challenges with NAGPRA. We don't want to go there, so we, without that body of the language, including into this policy, we don't know, where we're crossing that boundary of becoming a NAGPRA project, which puts us up against a different challenge whenever we have to deal with that one. They've already touched on the definitions of the permit area, which again is inconsistent with section 106. But I just wanted to emphasize that the guidance that they're discussing, I was glad to hear that they're actually going to come and talk to the tribes. I was a part of those very first website on-site meetings. The Federal Register notice was filed on the first part of June. We didn't find out till June 13th. And then the process of these consultation periods was not effective. And you can tell by the amount of tribal comments that have been submitted. When we know as tribal nations how deeply it affects our communities, it let me know that we weren't informed because we do care. And so that individual conversation that we need to have, you've got 574 tribes. Are you going to take that individual consultation meeting? That did not take place. We were included with the bulk of the conversation. Just like yesterday, after I did my presentation, I knew that after my presentation that others would come to me saying that I won't say these things in public, but I'll share them with you. We hold that sacred relationship, that bond that we have as THPOs, and we share that in these nation to nation consultation meetings. That's where, with these significant changes, these discussions will matter. So I thank all the tribes that are here today. These are some of the points that I wanted to make. It's been challenging, but I'm really glad that the day is here that we can have these discussions. And I'm really thankful for this panel who is a part of those changes, and that we can begin today. So wherever our mics are at, whoever wants to ask the first question, let's get started. Right here.
All right, coming over to you, Rebecca.
Rashasta, I got one. My name is Everett Bandy. I'm the THPO with the Keetoowah Nation. And I just first off want to thank you for addressing this issue and being willing to sit there today and talk about that. I realize this has been a long issue. I've been the THPO for 10 years now. Sheila, I remember that meeting in Tulsa all these years ago where we started talking about this. It's been something, like you said, that we've all been told is not going to change. And now they're telling us it may. And I'm glad to hear that. I have some comments to make. Appendix C is a symptom of an institutional paradigm among USACE of limited responsibility for their actions. As tribal representatives, we understand that you're permitting undertakings. And so you don't feel that they're, as an institution, as an agency, not you necessarily as an individual, but USACE doesn't feel that there's a complete responsibility for their permitted undertakings. We understand that. We disagree, however. I once heard my mentor say that USACE cares more about bats and butterflies than Indians. And it's kind of true. But I'm thankful today that you're looking at this issue and you're willing to address it, because it's the start of a change. And so I want to mention some related issues. Whenever USACE permits actions such as pipelines, they've always discussed how those undertakings are potentially possible without a permit. I would like to see that addressed. They talk about boring and how that can be used to avoid affecting waters of the United States. And then that manner, industry can avoid acquiring a permit. I hope to see that addressed. If you're affecting waters of the United States in some way or boring under a river, you should be getting a permit and you should be looking at the entire area of potential effect. Furthermore, in that vein, USACE has allowed in private industry to hire CRM firms that are of an adequate standard. I recall specific examples in Arkansas where we had 3 pipelines going through in the same year, and MIC archaeology firms, as I refer to them, were hired. Shovel tests were performed in known archaeological sites, and we worked with the archaeologists in Arkansas to go back and review those shovel tests that were done. The CRM firms reported negative findings when there was pottery and lithics in the shovel tests that they did. Those are known documented examples that we can provide you. That needs to be addressed as well. Not only the area of potential effect, but the quality of the cultural resource work that's being done. Furthermore, we have other issues with this permitting process where projects sometimes are begun and the applicant doesn't realize they need a permit, and they produce work designs and then come in and they realize that they're going to be needing a permit, and suddenly we're told that we're going to have to do a phase 3 mitigation and there's no ability to adjust the project. I've been THPO for 10 years and I can't count on my 2 hands the number of phase 3 mitigations that I've had to deal with in our ancestral homelands, for burial mounds, for sites that should not have been affected. I understand that there's times and need for projects that are needed for the safety of citizens today, and we have to work within the constructs of what we have. However, there's no reason why a private industry shouldn't be providing you with engineering designs beforehand. And then USACE simply says, okay, and moves forward and issues the permit. And we have extremely little to no ability to have the project altered. That's a major issue with this. That's another part of the symptom of institutional paradigm that I'm referring to, where USACE believes they have a limited responsibility over their permitted processes. Furthermore, I want to mention that better coordination with industry is needed so that they understand that they need to acquire permits before their designs are complete. And additionally, there's also another institutional issue where USACE has insisted for many years that their archaeologists, their district archaeologists, serve as tribal liaisons. What training does an archaeologist get that provides them the basis to be a tribal liaison? When you go to school for an archaeology degree, they don't teach you to be a tribal liaison. They don't make you go work with tribes. They don't teach you to understand tribal culture. They don't teach you to understand how to deal with a THPO. My office receives over 4,000 consultation requests in a year. And then we get a quote unquote tribal liaison / archaeologist coming in who has zero understanding of working with tribes. That's a major issue. That's a part of this symptom. Archaeologists are not tribal liaisons. The only thing an archaeologist can provide us is a detailed understanding of how a project is going to damage an archaeological site. A tribal liaison needs to be trained in how to deal with tribes. And I'd like to see that change. I'd also like to see USACE involved in coordination with industry in the form of conferences with industry. You should be present. If you're going to permit private industry, factories, pipelines, you should be present at the industrial conferences that they have, explaining to them the needs that they have and how they can better work with tribal nations. That is your responsibility as the lead agency. Again, I want to thank you for sitting there today. I realize this is a difficult issue, and it's been a contentious issue for many years. And I'm very thankful, as Sheila mentioned, to be seeing this changing. So I want to thank you for sitting there today and speaking with us.
Thank you, Everett. The meeting he was referring to was back in 2015. Charles Smith was working in the Civil Works office, and we invited a panel of them and the district folks from Houston to come to Tulsa to meet with 11 tribes. We had a panel of tribal attorneys that we had meetings teaching them about preservation laws so that they could represent our interests. So we had a whole row of tribal attorneys, and then we included our elders. We had a whole row of our tribal elders, and then we had all of our THPOs. We were ready to take on this challenge. And that's the first conversation we had about a complete revocation of Appendix C. And now we're in 2023. So it's not a quick and easy process, but I'm glad you mentioned that, Everett. Thank you. Next question. Right here.
Hi, I'm Rebecca from United Auburn, and I am hearing a lot about consultation. I'm not hearing anything about compensation. Only tribes can identify tribal resources. We have archaeologists being paid. We have the bats and the birds are very important, and we have biologists out there. But the bats and the birds are also tribal resources in many cases, because from the tribal perspective, ecology is culture. So I work with a council that is extraordinary in funding us, but that 4,000 requests that the first gentleman gets, that's pretty common. Anna here runs our cultural regulatory, and she gets hundreds of letters a day to process and to respond to. It doesn't matter how big the tribal preservation offices get, they're still understaffed. And we are fortunate that we are funded. We're not dependent on grants. Many other offices are. So we've been successful in some cases working with the Army Corps in Sacramento because the landowner itself paid for our tribal monitors to be out there. They understood the differences between the tribal landscape and the archaeological features. In some cases, the Army Corps did compensate our tribal monitors, but in some cases, that took Joe standing in front of the backhoe to get our point across. Because they were going to desecrate graves, because you're right, they don't always have to go around them. And we've learned to bypass the archaeologists and work with the project managers to get around the grave sites. But please, as you're thinking of, as we are jettisoning Appendix C, and I'm so very grateful for that, get the word compensation in there as well. Thank you.
Any more comments, questions?
Matakape, Betawashte, Chechi Chapalo, Hakaska, Hemachiape, na Washichu Ea, John Eagle Sr., Hemacha, standing up, yeah, you're shaking your head. You remember me, don't you, my friend? You know, Secretary Pinkham came to the homelands of the Hunkpapa following a request for nation-to-nation consultation, and he showed up with the Omaha office command. So there was officers sitting with him. And I just kind of want to encourage everybody that the reason why we asked for that is, to us, that was nation-to-nation consultation, to come to our homelands and allow us to follow our own ways of life in order to properly engage the United States government. And Mr. Pinkham, just so everybody knows, in our homelands, he spoke his own beautiful language to us that day. But you know, we got to get past the niceties, because sometimes the niceties keep us from really sharing what we think about things. And my friend, I'm not going to thank you for being where you're at. I'm going to say, be strong and be courageous, because we're also aware of the politics of Washington, D.C., and we're aware that you're dealing with pressures that we don't have to deal with. My father-in-law and I were watching the news, and they were talking about the American former government potentially being based off the Iroquois Confederacy. And when they said that, my father-in-law said they took something good and they made it bad. So I don't put my faith in federal government. I don't put my faith in federal laws, and I'll explain to you why. Because I want to, how would you say, stimulate your ancient DNA, that ancient DNA that you have that's just like ours. Because I don't like the word indigenous, because to me, indigenous just separates us from the rest of society. And I also understand what that word means. It means a dominated people. And it goes back to the papal bulls in the 1400 when a foreign religious leader said indigenous people were fractionated human beings, 1 part animal, 2 parts human. So when the immigrants hit these shores, they hit the shore with the doctrine of discovery, believing they had a God-given right to take it away from our ancestors because our ancestors weren't Christian. When they hit that beautiful Missouri River where I come from, they came with manifest destiny, again, believing they had a God-given right to take it away from us because my ancestors weren't Christian, but the narrative they used was that it was undeveloped. But Secretary Pinkham, you know, it was a highly developed place. Coast to coast, pole to pole, wherever my ancestors walked, you're in a site of religious and cultural significance to my people. The reason why I'm bringing this up to you is because the United States government, federal institutions, federal law still perpetrate that on us, constantly attempting to reestablish dominance over our people. And unfortunately, even this process that you're going through, it feels like that to me. Because like that lady said over there, we're invited into consultation with people that don't know how to engage tribal communities. We're actually invited to participate in Class 3 surveys, but the Corps of Engineers refuses to be financially responsible for that cost. And yet they'll pay a non-Indian CRM firm money upon money upon money to do those things. Now, I want to say something to all of you sitting out there just to kind of illustrate the difference between what an archaeologist sees and what an indigenous person sees. I want you to translate this for me. And no offense, but I know you can't translate that. What I said was that when we no longer cherish the land, we will no longer be Lakota. So an archaeologist is pulling from a different database than us. They're pulling from their education, their training, and their experience. But for us, we're pulling from our language, our sacred knowledge, and our star knowledge, and our oral histories. So Mr. Pinkham, while you're there, be fierce. Don't open doors for us, kick them down. Kick them down, because you're one of us in a foreign government. That government isn't how we make decisions, you know. But I just kind of wanted to say that much. And I'd like everybody to look back here. These 2 men sitting here. Anytime you have 2 or more Lakota, that's a war party. That's all about I want to say.
Thank you, John. Do we have any more questions out there?
Yeah, hi.
Okay, right here.
My name is Ellen Chapman and I work with Cultural Heritage Partners. We represent 6 of the 7 federally recognized tribes in Virginia. And we also do federal lobbying for tribal and non-tribal entities. And one question I had about the timing and just sort of the politics, because the previous gentleman was talking about the politics that's involved in this. What we saw under the Trump administration is that there was a tremendous amount of work that went into the BLM Planning 2.0 rule, and it got, approved and went through its final process. And then it was revoked by an executive order under the Congressional Review Act in the early days of the administration. So I know that this is, some people say it's more complicated, some people say it's less to do this rescission process. If you get it done by December, that will be in good time and that won't be possible. But if there are any delays, is that part of the conversation for the federal entities of making sure this process is done and more than 120 days have elapsed before a potential new admin? Thanks.
That's a good question. I'm going to let him answer this because that came up whenever we did our meeting in 2015. We felt like we were making real progress, and then the administration changed. So it was like wadding up all that and throwing it away. So I think the political timing is a good subject to bring up.
Yeah, our intention is to get it done this calendar year. So well within the timeline. And I appreciate Mr. Eagle's comments because administrations change, so it's important for us to get this done, get it in place, this administration, and hopefully it'll have some staying power. We've seen other cases. I mean, let's face it, when I was brought in, the pressure for change, that's what I was talking about, that pendulum swing. You know, I mean, nationwide permits, I mean, that was one, the Clean Water Act, under the waters of the US. We jumped in, the administration had issued a notice for us to revisit all the environmental rules from the last administration and set out a game plan. So that's why you saw us quickly doing it. But that is the politics, you know, seasons change, you know, and agendas change. So that's important for us to get it done before the next election cycle.
I think I would add just a little bit to that because it came up at the ACHP too, when we were talking about, there was a question briefly of, do we replace Appendix C with a different program alternative in accordance with with the Part 800 regulations? And one of the things that we kept coming back to was those take time because you need to consult and you have to have, I think the way I put it in one of those meetings was a reckoning of dealing with these decades of Appendix C and what it's done to the relationships that we all have. So, you know, trying to fit a program alternative under Part 800 regulations didn't seem feasible. And that was where we did agree. Rescinding Appendix C is paradoxically the simplest thing and probably the most permanent thing we can do. And then some other point down the road, we'll talk about a program alternative maybe as we navigate the post-Appendix C world. Is there a program alternative that might work? I'm not saying that that's a definitive. I'm just putting that out there. We knew that rescinding would probably be a safer choice now at this particular point in time. So.
Yeah, you know, and I'll just add, you know, with once it's rescinded, there's nothing to put back in place, right? So when Appendix C was first promulgated, it was codified into the CFR through formal rulemaking process. So they have to go through formal rulemaking to rescind it. Once it's out of the CFR, it's gone. And to put it back in, the Army Corps would have to engage in a whole new set of rulemaking to codify an additional, you know, a new appendix to their Part 325 regulations. Which if the Corps just went out and did that would be unlawful because they don't have the rulemaking authority to implement their own Section 106 regulations. They would have to go through a program alternative, develop a program alternative through the Part 800 regulations with the advisory council. So, you know, certainly in another administration, it wouldn't, a subsequent administration wouldn't be precluded from initiating that process with the advisory council. The Part 800 regulations give them the prerogative to do that. But that, you know, as Jaime was saying, that's potentially a very long process that requires the advisory council to approve it. And then, you know, if it's something that is not sufficient or that tribes don't believe is sufficient, it's a final agency action that certainly would be challenged. And so, you know, I think the rescission, I'm confident that's sort of the end of Appendix C, and it's, you know, what a subsequent administration might want to do separate from that. But I think there's enough process to ensure that if another administration wanted to do something, that they can't just wave a magic wand and have it happen. I mean, I'm sure they can do that, right? But it's not gonna hold muster. So I think I'd be hopeful that this is not one of those things that will just come back, you know, in 2 years or in 6 years or whatever it is. So.
Were there any more questions? I'd like to give Secretary Pinkham an opportunity to respond to some of the comments that have been made today before we end the session.
I have a comment from one of our virtual participants. I'm over here. Our member Diane Hunter, THPO for Miami Tribe of Oklahoma, had planned to be here with us today and got sick. So we hope that you're feeling better, Diane. She's emailed this to us. She has a brief comment. Sheila pointed out that we have different relationships with different Army Corps districts, and we're not given separate tribal consultation on Appendix C. As part of the guidance for commanders, et cetera, it should be emphasized that they should contact the tribes who have interest in their districts. We can provide guidance from our perspectives and about our cultural and historic interests in their district. It's an opportunity to build relationships and work more closely together, U.S., ACE, and tribes.
Thank you, Diane. Okay, if there's not any more, we'll let Secretary Pinkham respond to some of the comments that have been made as we conclude this session.
Well, again, thank you for the chance to join you today. It feels good to be back in Indian country. And it's great to have people that I worked with throughout my career in the audience and to keep those connections alive. And I appreciate Mr. Eagle's comment is, you know, you're working in a foreign government, because for most of my career, I was sitting where you're sitting, whether running the tribe's natural resource programs or being on a Nez Perce Tribal Council, and the challenges that you're dealing with. And I hear them, I understand them, and we're trying to make the change that we're capable of making. And it's great to have Mike Connor, Mike's from Taos Pueblo, to have a couple of people from Indian country running it. At one point, somebody said, look, the Indians are running the Army Corps of Engineers, which is a very unusual statement to hear. And I recognize, you know, the demands. We've got just, you know, we call it once in a generational opportunity when we pass the president's infrastructure bill. And right after that, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's putting a pressure on all of us, you included, building these bridges, going out and you know, redesigning navigation system, but also under IRA, the need for critical minerals to power this renewable energy wave that we see coming for us. Where are those renewable minerals coming from? Your homelands. I lived through that in the Columbia Snake River when the aspiration was hydropower. I know what that feels like. And so let's be clear that you know, the demands are going to grow. The needs for these stronger communications are going to be just as important as this country looks to reduce its dependency on a long term over fossil fuels. We're not going to do that overnight, but it'll take time. So for the need for critical minerals, the ability to implement this infrastructure bill to rebuild this country, it's going to require a lot of your work. Under one of the federal programs called the Federal Permitting Improvement Steering Council, we call it FPSC for short. They're setting aside $5 million because we recognize when we go through this, you know, permitting challenges, especially with as much as is coming on the ground, is tribal governments and local governments. You've got your own permitting and decision-making authorities, you know, that you've got to go through with all these too. So FPSC, and I believe they've started some of their consultation sessions, is set aside money that come under this federal dashboard to help support tribes for your engagement. I think is the question is, you know, where can tribes get some compensation to help get to the table to support these decision actions. So I'm hopeful that resources will come there. I know there are some cases where federal agencies have been able to use their discretion to support tribes in doing, you know, doing permits or doing evaluations. When I was at Nez Perce, you know, we had, I think, 3 regional forests, and you break that down into, you know, the forests and the districts. I was able to talk one of the forest supervisors into getting a Forest Service employee and put him at the tribe. So we had internal capacity to deal with all that permitting requests. I mean, this was reviewing things from, you know, doing rodent control to replacing bridges for hiking trails to timber sales to wildfire response, the whole thing. So there were some creative ways out there. And so I'd encourage the tribes with your creativity to keep pushing hard on the federal action agencies on trying to find some ways to alleviate the stress, because I fear that the stress is going to continue to build and become greater. A lot of work to do, but we will go through the rulemaking, and I find it curious. So you say rescinding Appendix C was the easy part, but you weren't sure you were going to get it done in your career, and it took 40-something years to do it. That doesn't sound easy to me. But no doubt the hard work there's still a lot of hard work ahead of us. And so I would appreciate, I mean, you that are here, going back to your tribal council, your political leadership, let them know this is coming. And as we did when we did the modernize effort, you know, we were entertaining if there were individual tribes that wanted consultation, you know, we're going to do our best to help satisfy that. So feel free to give us a call, get on the list, and we're on this ride with you. So thank you for your time and thank you for your support and in getting this milestone this far.
Sheila,
Thank you
that-
so much. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to kind of build on a couple of closing thoughts too,
Okay.
which are one, thank you, Jamie. You covered one of the talking points for my panel this afternoon. That FIPSI consultation is actually going on right now. And certainly an opportunity for the compensation part of this to be addressed. I would say that this is also something that the ACHP is looking at. Ira mentioned this morning, he couldn't remember the name of that guidance document. It's called Guidance on Assistance in the Section 106 process. So I know we're looking at that and also exploring the mechanisms that we can maybe amplify for agencies to use to get somebody like you did to help with navigating the federal processes and being more of a liaison to get through this. The timing issue has come up, a few times throughout this. And I would say one of the things that that I know John is keeping an eye on, I am keeping an eye on, is when and where we hear about some of the larger projects and some of the districts saying that they're going to use Appendix C, we're proactively notifying them of the need to start following 36 CFR 800. So we've advised them. I can think of probably 3 different projects right now off the top of my head where, we know that Appendix C hasn't been rescinded yet, but you should go ahead and start doing Part 800 now to have a better consultation process. But that relies on a phone call or an email from you as you start identifying these projects. So, the line of communication is always open to the ACHP. Please call or email us so that we can talk with you about the project, see what the issues are, and maybe get a letter out, start attending some of the consultation meetings and help advise core staff, but also you as you navigate the consultation process. So that was it for me. Thank you.
Wes, do you have any final words for us today on this?
Not really, other than, I think a lot of the work that we all do in cultural resource protection and in this area often is frustrating and we don't see good outcomes. So it's exciting that there's at least one thing that's
You bet,
positive.
yeah.
So at least it's fortunately, this is maybe a positive panel.
Well, we started off on a good note. Let's end on a good one. So Secretary Pinkham, thank you for being here. ACHP and our NATHPO/NARF representative, thank you for answering all the questions. And again, tribes, they said contact them. Do it. That's it. Enjoy your lunch.
Thank you to our panel. I'm just gonna I did a little bit of math, so I'm just gonna throw this out there that 5 million divided by 574 tribes is $8,710.90 per tribe. So let's make that 574 million, 1 million per tribe to start doing this. Having said that, it's lunchtime. So if we can have our elders given the opportunity to go and serve, or if an elder needs help with serving, please give them some assistance and we will start lunch. And once everybody is served and eating, we will have a couple of awards ceremonies. So please stick around for that as we honor some people who have done amazing work over the past year.